All right, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you all for joining. My name is Moishe Steigmanns, aka the Mindful Rabbi, and this is a new live stream conversation series that I am starting called Own Your Judaism. And I am very excited and very honored to welcome my first guest ever, Ellie Gettinger, who is the education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Ellie, thank you so much for your willingness to join and for being willing to take this plunge with me.
I'm totally nervous and totally excited, but it does seem entirely fair because you came on to my my online show. I think we're all in like the realm of being Sally, Jesse, Raphael at this point. I have glasses for it, and so I'm like, of course, yes, I have to come back. This is new and different for both of us. You know, this is not something either of us trained for or anticipated doing.
It is. So more nerves or more excitement for you, Ellie?
I would say nerves, because generally when I do a lot of online Facebook Live sort of programs, probably at least about 2 a week. And I think I did a count. I've done over 70 since quarantine started.
Wow.
Yeah. But generally I am in this place where I'm like, here is the museum content that I'm presenting today. This is how we're going to talk about this. And it's almost never personal. So this is a very different realm for me to actually engage my personal belief systems, as opposed to saying, let's talk about historically how belief systems have worked.
Got it. Well, again, thank you for your willingness to do that. And I know we've talked about some questions already, but this is the public world too. Obviously, we never have to share anything we don't want to. But I appreciate your willingness to jump into a conversation. So we've known each other, I think, 8 years. When my family and I moved back to Milwaukee in the summer of 2012, I can't remember if we had met before when I had visited. I was born and raised in Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. I forget how long you lived here, Ellie.
Actually, today is my 17th anniversary.
Today?
Today.
Amazing. Happy 17th anniversary.
Thanks. It's my 17th. It's my Milwaukee-versary.
Wow. And you celebrated with a little snow this morning.
I did. You know, when I moved here, I remember having an interview question. I've been with the Milwaukee Jewish Federation for 17 years, but I think my interview was like on October 12th. And I was like, is it really that cold here? I'd never experienced cold weather before. And they were like, nah, you'll get used to it. And I think I was here for like 3 days and it didn't snow, but the wind, that like October wind was so intense. And I'm like, I'm never going to be able to survive here. And 17 years later, it's still really cold in the winter.
It is. So as a born and bred Milwaukeean, moved back 8 years ago, I will give you my confession. For me, it's not about the cold. We were talking before our live stream started about how we deal with cold weather. It's not so much the cold, it's the length of the season, right? That it's not even November and we already had snow. It's been below, around the freezing temperatures in and out. And then it goes for a long time too. So it's just the length.
Well, you know that there is a chance in like April that there is snow still in the forecast. Like we know that is not even like a slim possibility that even if it's not snowing, that it's probably going to be that really cold, horrible rain.
Yeah.
It's not until like really June you feel that turnaround.
Yeah. My son's birthday is October 5th, 14th. My daughter's birthday is May 26th. And if I want to have an outdoor party for each, I have to worry. So all right.
So that was part of my thing, though, is I grew up in a small town in Tennessee. I went to school in California, so I'd never experienced weather before like this. And so I still think it's like one of these things that I just don't have the blood thickness for it.
Yeah. And I guess after 17 years, if it hasn't developed now.
It's not going to happen.
Nope. Well, you never know. So, all right. Ellie, tell me a little bit, please, about your Jewish life.
So, as I said, I grew up in a small town in rural East Tennessee. And people, when you say that, they always imagine that you're from like a suburb, like I grew up in Waukesha or something like that. But I actually grew up in a town of about 3,500. My family was the only Jewish family there. My parents, in fact, this is how small the town was. My parents are both family practitioners. And there were times, more than once, that we would get letters addressed to Jewish doctors, Madisonville, Tennessee, just the zip code, no address. Like that's the I don't think it would work anymore, but that was the size of the town I grew up in. And it meant very much that I felt a keen responsibility early. I felt a sense of difference early on. I remember when I was in first grade, there was a Christmas pageant at school, and it wasn't like a Santa sleigh bell sort of Christmas pageant, but it was an actual Jesus story in the Christmas pageant. And I made a decision as a 6-year-old, and I think my parents were like, you can do it if you want to do it. And I was like, I don't want to be in that. And I sat in the library while my classmates were performing. Like I can remember that pretty distinctly, that it was like a choice that I made to sit back and not be part of this pageant or play. I don't know. And I'm actually unclear as to why Jesus was in the Christmas play at school, but we'll leave that for another time. It was the 80s in rural East Tennessee. And so who's to say that it's not still happening? But that was definitely, but I do also feel like we made this very conscious sense of being kind of educators about this. So when I was in second grade, my mom loaded up my like little red wagon, and I went from class to class to class and explained Hanukkah. And when I was, and throughout elementary school, whenever like Sukkot would happen, there would be walking field trips to my family's sukkah. Like there, so I think in some ways it would have been harder if we were very secular in our Jewish practice, because we were committed Jews who we drove an hour to Knoxville to go to synagogue. We were engaged in our Jewish community there, that it made it easier for the people in our town who were very religious as well. You know, that this is a pretty, you know, it's the buckle of the Bible Belt, that there were all sorts of people who could see that we were deeply religious and that they could respect that in a way. So I don't feel, with the exception of those kinds of feelings of discomfort and feeling like, well, it's Friday night and I'd really rather be at a football game than sitting at my family's Shabbos table, or there's no one here to date, or no one will date me because I'm Jewish. Like those feelings were there, but I don't feel like I had a sense of being separated because I was Jewish, or anti-Semitism specifically. But I think it really was this sense for me, and it's one of the things I say from a professional standpoint that was very helpful, is I spent most of my childhood explaining what it means to be Jewish, and it's what I do still.
You know, you're certainly not alone, because you could be in a bigger city and still want to be going to football games on Friday night instead of being at home. But it's different when you're the only family in that community that's wrestling with that, and you're the only kid who's wrestling with that. You know, I know you started talking a little bit about it, but are you able to think back to your childhood and reflect the relationship or interplay between pride in your Judaism, teaching, sharing it with others, and perhaps self-consciousness or isolation?
I definitely, I think I've always been a tremendously outspoken person. In fact, my senior superlative was most outspoken. I know you're the people who know me who are watching this are not surprised. So I think that I was always saw it as like a responsibility and not a sense of discomfort. I think that it was more the sense of, you know, I'm here to talk about this. I'm here to tell people. I'm here to kind of inform, remove misinformation. If there is misinformation, like I think already there were, now that I'm in this deep psychological place, I'm like, I do remember there were occasional conversations about Jews killing Jesus that I would have to like debunk. And, you know, those sorts of perilous things that you get into the fray. And I remember kind of the sense of, I wouldn't say shame, but deep, it definitely wasn't shame. It was like a deep awareness when we were studying the Holocaust that this was my family's experience, but not anyone else's in the room. Like I had a close connection to this. I think similarly, because so many of the people I was in school with, you know, had been in the mountains there for many, many, many generations. The idea of having immigrant parents or grandparents was very literally foreign to them. So now that's changed a lot in this area. There are a lot more people coming in, but when I was there, like the fact that my grandparents were both immigrants was something that no one else could reflect on. And just the fact that they came from a place like Russia and not Scotland or Ireland, which is where most of the people, their families were from, was very different too. So that's, I think, where I felt that sense of awareness. There was this moment I can remember with my 7th grade. This is very deep dive. Like my 7th grade social studies teacher was a guy named Mr. Mosier, and he was an expert storyteller, and he did the story of the 6-Day War. And and it's like in that moment, like, as he's talking about the time, and in that very triumphal way that I think a lot of us now are a little bit like, yeah, 6-Day War, great military victory, all the repercussions. There's some challenges and reflect. But in that moment, I was like, yeah, Israel. Yeah, that's me. I'm Jewish. I've been to Israel, and that kind of enthusiasm that I don't know if I've ever regained. Wow. But Mr. Roger certainly had that like influence as a storyteller, and I have no idea, because I think 7th grade history was actually Tennessee history. So I have no idea why we were talking about Israel at all.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that memory. You mentioned that kind of your whole childhood, you were educating people about being Jewish. You also mentioned, your job now. Again, you're the education director here at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Was it always a purposeful path or plan to go into education, and particularly Jewish education?
Oh no, I'm the queen of the world's like lamest epiphanies. Like they're like, oh yeah, that's where I've been going. But it's like, and for instance, I went to college and I worked at Hillel. After a year of trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, I ended up majoring in Jewish studies because I couldn't decide between history or religious studies or English. And so this is a way of doing all of those things. And I was spending a summer interning at Hillel in DC. And I had this moment of like, maybe I want to be a Jewish communal professional.
Ooh.
Like it was like, and I thought this was like a brilliant epiphany. Like, I'm like, oh, wow, what a smart move for me. And then, so I moved to Milwaukee to do fundraising for the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. I worked as their young leadership coordinator. And after 3 years, the Jewish Museum was opening. And it felt like this way of taking my profound passion for Jewish history and my great love of talking and kind of marrying the two. And luckily I was working with the brilliant Kathy Bernstein, who is willing to say, hey, you don't have any museum experience, but I'm kind of new at this too. And let's figure this out together. Cause I'd never worked in a museum. And so a lot of the kind of museology stuff that I do is stuff that I've learned on the job or figured out as I've gone along and kind of developed. I will say that I do have a profound, my family is deeply engaged in Jewish life and culture, where we belong to our synagogue. My dad is a phenomenal Torah reader. Like
I heard him read Torah. Yeah.
Literally, like I think I'm going to say one of the best 5 in the world. And you guys, you can have him on here and he'll read Torah for you and you'll know.
Thank you.
Excellent. But he wrote a book about it. So, I mean, and my grandfather was the executive director of the Atlanta Jewish Federation. So it's like, my great uncle was the head of the Orthodox Union. So I feel like I have this deep grounding in Jewish life and culture that is kind of strangely that it gives me this other way of looking at it because of my Tennessee life. In any other universe, I think if we'd grown up in Providence or Boston, or I think I would have had a very traditional Jewish upbringing. And I don't know if I would have felt the same sense of, desire to be in a Jewish community in the same way, because it would have always just been part of my life, all of my life, not just the fact that it was my, this was my weekend life or my after school life between BBYO and all those things.
Wow. I can relate a little bit to the professional path, because growing up, I always said I would never be a rabbi. Right? Always. Yeah. Through middle school, high school, early college, I would never be a rabbi. And, but again, like I think I'm finding my place within the rabbinate too. This ability to, launch my organization.
So what changed?
What changed?
Yeah. When was that moment when you're like, actually, probably I'm going to be a rabbi?
It was in college. It was in college. I started college planning to major in electrical engineering, go to law school, and do patent law.
Yeah.
And I always loved teaching, though. I love kids. I love teaching. I started babysitting when I was 11. I worked at Milwaukee Jewish Day School, which I attended as a kid. I was in the first graduating class. I worked there in summers. In college, when I'd come home to be a substitute teacher, I loved teaching. So eventually, I figured I would go into education, and then I kind of eventually got lost and found myself in the rabbinate. So. Yeah.
I think that was one of the things that was kind of unintentional that I discovered is that I knew I loved history. And I love history in a very I want to tell those stories. I want to talk through them. I love the process of research. I hate writing though. And in terms of people who love history but hate writing, it's a challenge because I'm never going to be a professor. I can't be an academic because I can't sit there and sit and think, but I could sit and do the research. I could sit and think, but can I put the pen to the paper to put my ideas together in that very organized way? I'm not always the best at that. So this was a real way that I had never actually considered that, I can do research and discovery and then I get a forum for talking about things. But I don't necessarily have to, I have to write, but I don't have to write chapters for books or articles. I can write for an audience that actually is going to read and appreciate what I'm writing.
Yeah. And COVID is
immediate feedback from people.
Exactly.
I love feedback. It's one of my favorite things. I'm like, what do people think? Oh yeah, great. Thanks.
And COVID has probably opened that up for you because now we have so many more opportunities to talk, present, to share, to converse like this, right? With all the 77 different, was it 77?
Yes. On some level, it's been amazing. I've had, I just found a teacher at UWM assigned my museum moments to her sources and methods class, and they did responses. It was great. I got actual feedback from people. But what I really miss is when I have a group of students in the museum and I can say, okay, Moishe, what are you thinking in this moment? And I can really get that eye contact and I get a high off that in a way that virtual programming just doesn't do.
Yeah. Yeah. And before we continue with the conversation, I'll just remind everyone, Ellie is the education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. I have brought a group of students on a tour with her, and she is remarkable. She's incredible, engages the students, captivates them, and the museum moments that she's been doing. So they're really
I do virtual tours as well, actually, at this point. So if anybody's interested in a virtual tour, clearly you could be in New York, you could be in Ashwaubenon, you could be in Azerbaijan, and I can do them from anywhere. We just have to get the timing right.
Excellent. So you can Google search Ellie or PM me, and I will put a message in the comment. I'll get you her contact info. So we talked a lot about your childhood in Judaism and some of the inspirations and challenges. Let's move now to the present. What is meaningful to you about Judaism? What is relevant to you about Judaism?
So it's interesting. The way this conversation started was we were in a MJDS, Milwaukee Jewish Day School, high committee meeting. And Moishe and I both are on the Jewish committee and I think they were like, who are the parents that are going to want to talk about Judaism? Oh yeah, these two. They're the ones who want to do that.
We profile pretty well for that, don't we?
We do. But it's a great committee. And they open each committee with a kind of crazy question. You're like, what was your most profound experience of God? I think was the question that they asked. And this is not a question you usually use as a mixer. And I related that I don't really have a great relationship with God, in that God is not I am active in my Judaism in a number of ways. I belong to a synagogue. I keep kosher. I make all of these points of saying Shema with my kids every night. But in terms of actual engagement with something divine, that is something that is so separate from my everyday. So a lot of times my sense of Judaism is that understanding the story, the history, the commandments, performing them to the best of my ability and to the way that I feel appropriate. And that's it. Like, it's a very ritual centric focus. And spirituality is just not something I feel, despite the fact that I'm like a yoga person and like, it's just not how, like, even in yoga, my big concentration is just on breathing, not on kind of the bigger universe. So I think that I haven't really found that way of kind of what a deep spiritual connection with would look like. And I think in some ways going through the motions of ritual is like this kind of, maybe someday the training wheels will come off and I'll have that sense of what a spiritual universe looks like.
Yes. Yeah, so you started unpacking the question of how do you engage with a religion that is so predicated on theology and on belief, right? All of the stories which are inspiring you, right? If it's the stories from the Torah, from the Bible, from throughout Jewish history, the 6-Day War story that your teacher, your 7th grade teacher, so proudly shared in class, that there's God present in these, right? So how do you engage with these? How do you, I don't know, how do you come to terms with defining your practice based on a story, based on a belief that doesn't align with your belief system?
I think that I tend to really engage in the human element in these stories. And in that human element, seeing the goodness in people, seeing the way that people are regarded and engaging, that's where I see God. When people are good, when people are doing good things, that's God to me, or as much as I can identify God. So when I try and look for actual miracles, that's harder for me to say. Instead, here's that divine in all of us, I think is a lot easier in a less of a all around us is Shekhinah sort of way. Like, that is totally, anytime I've been in those kinds of Jewish confines, I tend to really shut down and be like, this isn't working for me. But if I can think about the fact that you're doing good things, or Rabbi Hillel was doing, this was his role in the world as a good person, then that is a little bit easier for me to understand that kind of divine element. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that rather than God being this omnipresent, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-encompassing deity, that it sounds like you see godliness in human beings and in our interactions and the goodness that we put into the world, right?
I hope to see it. Sometimes I don't at all. I mean, it goes back and forth. Like, because you can see also the incredible stupidity and the incredible meanness, the evil in people as well. So I think that by trying to focus on those kinds of moments of shared humanity or moments of goodness, that does give me a sense of the divine. But it's not something that I commune with in a way that I try to cultivate it, but I'm not out there saying, big presence, tell me what I should be doing. No, I'm like, this is me trying to do my best to be a good person in the world. And that's the only way I can fathom the divine.
How do you engage with prayer?
I like prayer because, so I'm a member of our conservative synagogue here in Milwaukee. And I especially appreciate the conservative liturgy because I grew up with it. And so I feel like there's like this regimented kind of, again, following the ritual, being in touch with that. And there are kind of moments of transcendence that I can get when everyone's on the same note at the same time. Our cantor once, I had this moment where I put it there. There are a couple of tunes you can do to Eitz Chaim Hi, and Eitz Chaim Hi is about as close as I ever get to kind of a sense of divine in the, and I think some of that is by design, right? You've got the ark open, everybody's standing, you're all holding out kind of a beautiful note. The text itself is beautiful. There's so many things going for you in Eitz Chaim Hi that's like elevating that sense of purpose. But there's one particular tune that I'm like, this one is just my liturgical sweet spot. I love that tune. And so the nice thing is that once your cantor and they know that you're in synagogue and he sees me there, that I know he does that tune for me. And it is like a moment that even that sense of like, hey, this is something that he's doing because he knows I love that tune. Those are the little things, but I think it's mostly a rote process of, And as you can attest, because we often sit next to each other when we're at synagogue, back in the day when we used to sit near people in a synagogue space, I am a pretty shameless talker in synagogue.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how we're going to go back to social distance sitting in synagogue, Ellie. This is going to be brutal for you and me not to be able to talk.
We'll just have to come up with like a telephone, like we'll get the can. I mean, I think it's Shabbos appropriate if we have a can and a, hey, Moishe, this is going a little long today.
Yeah. I'll put my rabbit keep on for a moment right now and say that is definitely okay.
I mean, there's no electrical. There's
nothing.
I'm going to make it before Shabbos, obviously.
And we'll drop it off at the synagogue before Shabbat too. We don't even have to.
It'll have like a place.
Exactly.
But if you carry it, it's good.
So for a little bit of context, Ellie was talking about prayer Eitz Chaim Hi, which literally means it is a tree of life. And that's referring most commonly to the Torah, to the 5 books of Moses, which in Judaism is considered a living, breathing document, that it continues, that even if the words of the text do not change, our interpretation of them, their application in today's world is continually living and breathing. And we, in many ways, as Jews, derive life and sustenance from our relationship with the Torah. So Ellie was talking about the melodies for Eitz Chaim Hi, and it really sounded like it was jumping back to me to the history and the story and the peoplehood of Judaism, which is what connects you, right? Because this is where we as a community are putting the Torah away after we've read it from it publicly. We're putting it back in the ark. This is where everyone is singing together. It's almost as if the bride and the groom are walking down the aisle, or the groom and the groom, or the bride and the bride are walking down the aisle, and we're singing them in song as they walk down the aisle. We're returning the Torah to the ark. That's a moment of collective community. And then that personal touch that you just added, right, which is that the cantor, Chazan Jeremy Stein, that Chazan Stein, if he sees you, that's almost that moment of godliness, that he sees you and he's trying to do a little bit of good in the world.
He's just trying to help connect me that much more. Like he knows this is the thing that might, and I will tell you, the one time, the closest I feel like I've ever gotten to that actual sense of the divine happened in my childhood synagogue in Knoxville, Tennessee. And it was a Saturday when I had gone in. I was responsible for dropping my younger brother off at junior congregation. And generally on those days that I was in charge of that, I would go hang out with a friend, or I would go, but I didn't have anything going on. So I went to services, and that was, not my usual like 17-year-old thing that I'm going to go like sit in services. And I remember the ark was open. The stained glass windows were and I could spend hours telling you exactly about the stained glass windows in my childhood synagogue. Like I would, there's this one collection that looks like a dress. There's this other that looks like bamboo that I was obsessed with just staring at it, and the color is coming through, and everybody in the congregation held out that last note of Eitz Chaim Hi. And that's about the closest I feel like I've ever had that kind of, oh, this is what God feels like. And it was a strange feeling for me, but I'm like, oh, this is what people talk about. And so I think every time with Eitz Chaim Hi, and I can tell you doing it on Zoom has not been the same for me.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't have that same kind of sense of big community, people coming together, the note being held, because clearly singing on Zoom is a disaster. As a community,
right.
You can have a singer, you can't have a community of singers. That it's, that one note at the end, that's, so I think I'm always kind of trying to reach back to that moment where I was like, maybe that's what spirituality, what being a spiritual person feels like. But I think otherwise, for the most part, I find great meaning in the ritual, and I find meaning in being part of that continuity, as you said. Like, this is the largest Jewish community I've ever been a part of. And I love that, it feels so homey, and there's so many different ways of connecting, and there's so many different people to connect with. And that on the flip side, if you ask anyone else in kind of the bigger Jewish world, oh, Milwaukee, that's a tiny Jewish community.
Right. In Judaism, people often ask me questions like, why do you have to pray every day? Right? Why do you pray every day? Or why do you do these rituals again and again, every week, every year? And there are really kind of 2 branches of Jewish response to that. One is because you're in a relationship with God, right? And if you're in a relationship with God, of course you're going to pray every day, right? You talk to your kids every day, maybe your partner, a friend, your coworkers, right? You're not going to walk into the office and ignore everyone just because you saw them yesterday. The other, well, the coworker, right. The other stream of thought is that having a heightened experience with God every single day, it's just not possible. We cannot be in such an intense, heightened spiritual state at all moments, right? It's overwhelming for a human being. Rather, we pray every day just for the possibility that maybe we'll get that spark of something every once in a while. And I don't know if you've heard that before, Ellie, or I don't know if that's been on your mind at all, but as you're working, right? Like you talk about this Eitz Chaim moment where sometimes when everyone's praying together, you're not sure what you feel. You're not even sure how to define it, if it's spiritual or this, but there's something and it triggers this wonderful memory you had from childhood. But it sounds like for you that you continue to do this in part because of the community, but there's at least that possibility, even if your head tells you it's incredibly remote or improbable, that some kind of connection can happen.
Yeah, no, and it makes me very much aware of my motivation in those moments as well. You know, like, am I coming at, I think it gives me a place in a service where I can say, where is my focus? Because, you know, I know when I'm focused and when I'm not. And it's probably true because you're not focused if I'm not focused.
Exactly.
But is this the moment that I can relate to? Is this the moment that I can I get there? And I think it's like a kind of, in some ways, it's a pinnacle within at least our congregation, because it's right after you've read the Torah service where it does become pretty easy to disengage. So it is like hey, I've got to get back in this feeling and think about this because I've been separated. And I'm really interested in that feeling post-COVID of what it's like to sit in a space, and to have that moment where you can't do laundry while you're watching services, or all the things that, you know, or I'm crocheting, or any of the stuff that I've done while I've been watching services while through quarantine. Will I be able to kind of judge my focus still, or have I lost that? I would hope I haven't.
Well, maybe we'll have you on again when that happens. We'll see. We'll do a follow-up. So,
I mean, this is all to question when quarantine ends anyway. And
right. Well, yeah, and maybe hopefully I'll have you on, you know, in the next 6 years before all this ends, right? So before my final question, another one jumped to mind, which I hadn't thought about before, and if it's putting you on the spot, I apologize. But one of the core fundamental drivers that I have had, and I'm actually, I'm finally writing my first book, which I'm a few chapters in, and it's based it's based on 10 mindful principles, or 10 principles for mindful Jewish living in the 21st century. Right. So that's the working tag, the working part after the colon, the title part for the book. And one of them, which has been a key driver for me, is there's no such thing as a bad Jew. Right. And I hear a lot of times when people talk to me, particularly about God, they say, like, I don't really believe in God, or I don't think God did this. And there's almost a sense of shame or embarrassment, right? So I appreciate, first of all, you're coming on to this conversation and talking and sharing. And
yeah, I hope I don't get email for my lack of belief.
No.
Guys, don't, you know, this is just me. I'm not. And the other super strange thing is that generally, because I work in a Jewish professional space that is not in a religious sector, that I'm often like, well, this is how the spectrum of Jews believe. I'm almost never talking about my own personal belief. So it is very like this kind of strange, like I feel like I need to caveat everything to say, but many Jews believe this, this, and this. And this is how, you know, most Jewish experiences are not like, just because that's what I normally would do.
Right. So no, I don't think this isn't a question about backlash. This is a question about inspiration. Right? Because when somebody else comes to me and says, I don't think I really believe in God, or my relationship with God's not important, can I be an atheist and can I be Jewish? Right? How can I have a meaningful Judaism without believing in God? I now have a live stream conversation to which I can point them. But again, I'm putting you on the spot a moment. So you can certainly say no, or you could just log off and avoid the
disappear.
Yeah, I don't know if you've thought about it, do you have a response that you would give to someone, right? If I were a Jew coming up to you and I were just talking with you, or I came to you after a tour and you were showing a painting, a religious painting that shows a Bible scene, and I say something like, you know what, I really struggle with this because I don't believe in God and I still want to be Jewish and it doesn't feel right, right? I would say there's no such thing as a bad Jew. I have my own spiel, but what would you say?
I think I would say there's so many different ways to be Jewish, to be a Jew. That I think it's, one of the things is there is no monolithic, this is the be all and end all. And I think one of the things about Judaism is that we all like to claim that bad Jew status on some level, like it's part of the tradition of, there are 4 children who are at the Seder. One of them is the wicked child. So if we all have that in us, then that's there all the time anyway. But I think that for me, it's like that question of the stranger thing is my commitment to observance, despite my lack of belief on some level. And I would say that is just a way for me to keep my life in line. I think about the kosher question is the one that I get the most. Why do you keep kosher? What? Clearly, it would be much easier and much cheaper to just get meat from the store, any store. So much easier. And I think for me, and this actually I started when I was in high school. I went on an Israel trip. It had this moment where I was like, well, I think I want to take on a little bit more of this kind of sense of ritual. And so I stopped eating meat and milk together, and I stopped eating pork. We had always kept kosher in my house growing up, but I was a huge proponent of pepperoni pizza until I was 17. I remember it being delicious, but not as delicious as I remember bacon. I know this is not where you expected the Mindful Rabbi session to go.
No, actually, this is exactly where it goes, right? Because it's about making mindful choices in your Jewish life, right? The name of this live stream series is Own Your Judaism, right?
Right.
So this is exactly where I want to
Judaism is the flip side of this. So I stopped eating this, and I think at first it's mostly like, hey, I just want to see if I can do it. And then as I stopped eating non-kosher meat altogether when I got to college, just because it felt disingenuous to say I was keeping kosher and then to explain all of the ways in which I was caveating it. But I think the big thing it gave me was this way of every time I sit down to eat, I have to think about my Jewish belief and practice. So and then when people are always like, well, why would you do it? What is, and the Torah doesn't give us answers on that. It just says you shouldn't eat meat and milk together. Or it doesn't even say that. It just says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. There's no answer there. So for me, it's this way of really thinking conscientiously about food and my relationship to food, where it's coming from and what's happening with it. And for anyone who knows me, you guys know I have a tremendously close relationship with food. I love to cook. And so I love to feed people, but it does really kind of push me in this place to be like, well, there's a limit. I'm not going to, there are so many delicious things out there in the world, but these are the delicious things that are accessible to me.
Yeah. I relate to that entirely. I mean, you're talking about a mindful approach to eating that's aligned with the values that Judaism brings to you. And I wrestle with that when it comes to wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, a head covering. I'm not wearing one now, right? Like I'm doing rabbi work, right? And I'm not wearing one now. It's not purposeful that I'm sitting at a camera angle where you couldn't tell for sure. Like I'm not wearing one now, but I always, that's where my big wrestling comes in, right? Is how to reconcile those things. And look, I think anyone in Judaism, we always wrestle with things. And yeah. So I appreciate, again, your honesty. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I do think if we're not wrestling, if we're not questioning something, then that is like a fundamental part of being Jewish. Someone asked, I was in a conversation with some students from Rufus King last week, and they were like, what do you think is like, what is your favorite part about being Jewish? And I think for me, one of my favorite parts about being Jewish is the argument, is the like, that it's not supposed to be the sort of thing that you, Moishe, the rabbi, is telling me, this is how you live your Judaism, that it's me saying, well, that's how you say I should live my Judaism, and this is how I'm going to live my Judaism. And that's an ongoing debate, and we can have it.
I wish we had had this conversation 20 years ago, because I describe myself now not as a sage on the stage, but as a guide by the side, right? In that exact same language. It's not my job to tell you how to be Jewish. You're going to be Jewish in your own way, and you just wouldn't listen to me anyway, right? But my job is to be there to support you in your Jewish journey. So I wish we'd had this conversation 20 years ago, so I could have thought about this 20 years ago instead of just over the past few years, right? So.
Well, I so appreciate the opportunity to share my sense of religious practice. I hope that if there are people who are watching that they've enjoyed it, and feel free if you have questions. I'm easily findable on Jewish Museum Milwaukee's website. I am by no means a private citizen in any.
No one is anymore.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you again. This Ellie Gettinger, Education Director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee, a friend of mine here in Milwaukee. We're about an 8-minute bike ride away from each other right now.
Thank you. Right now.
Yeah, we're all home right now. So, and it's it's okay to bike. I don't want to bike when it rains or snows, but cold I think is okay. Jog?
What?
You jog?
I do. I will jog in this.
Okay.
I'll jog till it's about 20.
All right, so 15-minute jog, maybe something like that. But thank you again very much for your time, and again, thank you for your openness and you're willing to share about your story and how you've been owning your Judaism in your life.
Thank you.